Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. For anybody who doesn't know, I'm Phil's wife, Brenda, and we're going to celebrate his life this afternoon, which is, as you can see, with balloons and all the rest of it. We intend to make it a proper celebration, and we'll talk about Phil's personality, his achievements, all sorts of memories. And we'll be watching lots of video footage. Can you all see the screen okay from the back? Yes? Good, okay. I've put together some text which various people are going to read. They've been cajoled or threatened into taking part, possibly, but they've all agreed to read bits each, which is great because nobody wants to listen to me all afternoon. Now, Phil wouldn't want a celebration without a drink, of course, so after we've finished all the speeches and stuff, then we'll be having a bite to eat, and we'll also be having a glass of wine to toast, and we'll be drinking a toast to him. Here today are Phil's brother and Phil's brother Michael, his wife Ingrid, and Phil's nephew Martin. Could you just please stand up and turn around so people know who you are? So, right. Okay. Thank you. Just so that, you know, if you want to talk to them afterwards, obviously that would be great. Also, here are some of my siblings. So there's Trevor and Pam, and my nieces, that's Susanna, Lizzie and Amy Jane. Could you also please just stand up so everybody knows who you are? Yay. Okay, now I've got two other siblings, Brian and Heather. They're unfortunately not able to be with us this afternoon, but they are here in spirit. They're ill and so on, so can't come. Now I'm going to ask Susan Davidson, please, to come up and speak to people a little bit about Phil's early life. Susan was one of Phil's colleagues at Age UK, one in the research department, and she knows him pretty well. So, thank you.
Hello. So, Phil was born, as he would say, at a very early age in 1952 in Newcastle-on-Tyne. He always maintained that his parents thought they'd completed their family after Richard, his older brother, was born. He said they named him Philip Stephen because he was a bit of an afterthought, P.S. He was brought up in Manchester and studied there. One of three brothers with Michael and Richard, the family always did a lot of walking, and Phil took the opportunity to get out in the fresh air. He played a lot of football in the street and in the local park. Phil was bright and witty. Even at an early age, he came out with the most awful puns, making everyone groan, but they nevertheless loved him for it. He started university at age 17 and got a first-class honors for his bachelor's degree in German language and literature. An MA and 2 years of a PhD later, he got married, very lucky catch he had, and did a postgraduate training and teacher training course. He ended up teaching for 25 years, which, he said, is quite long enough for anyone. In true Phil fashion, he inspired his pupils to love the German language and often took them on exchange visits abroad. During this time, he pursued his hobbies. First of all, cooking. Some of those exotic meals and Sunday roasts were amazing. He loved traveling and most sports. Above all, he loved making people laugh. I expect many of you have experienced a social or even a work occasion where Phil would sit quietly, listening to the conversation, thinking but not saying anything. Then suddenly he would mutter quietly a cracking little comment that would have everyone falling over in laughter. Phil progressed in his career, teaching first in, I don't know how to pronounce this, Barnstaple? Then moving on for promotion each time to Crawley, Beckenham, and eventually became head of languages at Derrick Wood School in Orpington. After a few years, he started applying for deputy headships, but got a bit disillusioned with the changes in education at the time. Society's general lack of respect for teachers, the introduction of Ofsted inspections, and the resulting reduction of teachers' autonomy in the classroom, etc. Even retired teachers have nightmares about not having kept up with marking exercise books or having neglected to take the register for 6 months, that kind of thing. It's no coincidence that Phil's new novel is called The Stealth Inspector. Can't wait. And it concerns a school with an impending offset inspection. More of that later. Eventually, Phil jumped ship and embarked on a second career of fundraising and research in charity organizations. Phil really took to both the work and his colleagues at Help the Aged. And here is Paul Cann, former Director of Policy at Help the Aged, to talk about working with Phil and what he achieved there. Over to you, Paul.
Hello, everybody. What I think about Phil is that he wanted everyone around him to flourish and to succeed. And that was a generosity of spirit that I saw at work every day when we worked together at Help the Aged. So many different examples of that. There was one tiny episode which brought this out for me when he and I were interviewing a candidate for a job in the policy team together. Our recruitment interviewing styles were somewhat different. I don't know if you remember or ever saw those John Cleese management training videos showing how not to do it. That was me, sitting hunched on the end of the desk, radiating tension, asking 5 questions in one and not waiting for the candidate to complete their answer before going on. Phil, in contrast, sat back, relaxed, smiling, open, and encouraged the interviewee to show that they had something to offer. And I realized that this wonderful open style, believing in people, was something that he had naturally. But of course, it had also been developed by years and years and years of modern languages oral examinations. I don't know if any of the teaching colleagues of his in the room can empathize with that, coaxing students in an oral exam to say something, anything, in their exam language. And he believed in us. There was no ego in Phil, just a devotion to find and use the evidence and support and help the team effort. This could have been in the research projects that he directly managed, or in the service that he rendered every day to colleagues working in policy or campaigns or media or in the practice. And a typical support role would be finding and laying the ground for our many public statements. Very often, I or a colleague would kind of waft into the office and throw out a statement. There's a report on this subject by Newcastle University in 2002. I think we should look at it sometime. And Phil would disappear and reappear 5 minutes later to say, it's by Keele University in 2006, and here's a copy. I feel that he anchored us, helping, there were some of us perhaps at risk of making enthusiastic and grand assertions not necessarily supported by the facts, to ground what we did and said in the world of evidence. And he studied that evidence so carefully. If Help the Aged grew as the national campaigning force in that time, we did so standing on his shoulders. He made many important contributions of his own, as well as empowering those around him. And I would like to single out his spotlight reports that he did at Help the Aged, which explored key indicators of quality of life for older people, highlighting vividly and accessibly the major developments in the evidence base. And it was his spotlight report of 2007 which actually created the start of what turned out to be a tide of awareness about the problem of loneliness and isolation in later life. And Phil kept shining a searching light on the evidence which the campaign to end loneliness, for example, brought to its work. As I found, even when I visited him and when his illness had made speech very difficult, and communication very taxing. He did the editing legwork when I was preparing a book on the theme of unequal aging, which was then and still remains a hugely troubling aspect of society and the way we grow older in society. But I think one of his most influential contributions was at Age UK in developing the index of quality of life for older people. And what he did there was he brought really compelling evidence data and brought out the finding that actually what most older people want, most of all, is to have a life, to enjoy taking part in a cultural or creative activity, singing, dancing, whatever. And I think this was a really important challenge to the kind of mindset we sometimes have about older people, which just prioritizes the functional, the material, the survival, over living life to the full. And of course, Phil lived life to the full, against all the odds. So, as I say, Phil wanted everyone around him to succeed, to flourish. And my concluding memory here is one weekend, a few of us at Help the Aged had taken the strange decision to spend Sunday morning running a 10K race in London, the London 10K. I don't know what had got into us that day and what lapse of sanity there had been, although Phil would pull out that phrase, lapse in sanity, and point to the logical flaw in the premise of that phrase. But I knew that we were united as a group in the firm policy department principle of going to the pub afterwards. As we set off, Phil sprang forward at a pace which I regarded as probably foolhardy and certainly well beyond me. But Phil was looking back at me all the time, encouraging me to get going, to run as fast as I could, and to be with him on that run. And that sort of reminded me, I don't know if you ever saw the European Championship race there was once, where in the last lap of that race, it was on telly, where Mo Farah sprinted off on the last lap, but spent the first 200 yards of that lap looking back at his slower teammate, encouraging him to run. So on that Sunday morning, Phil was my Mo Farah, and he was all of us a quiet inspiration.
Thank you, Paul. That was brilliant. And thank you, Susan, as well. So we're now going to see a video recording of a speech that Phil gave as best man at the wedding of our good friends Lorna and Ron Sheldon. This was back in 1999. For those of you who knew Phil before he got MND, you'll recognise his great wit. And for those of you who have only known him since he was diagnosed, I think it'll be quite an eye-opener for you.
Phil, I'm so grateful for you agreeing to be my best man. You're my final winner of an Oscar for agreeing to take on the role tonight. So I wonder whether, Alan, you could do the honours. Over to you, Phil. Do your worst.
Well, I'd like to thank my family. Okay, well, it sounds like I've already been introduced, but I'm still going to introduce myself again. I am actually Phil. The reason I'm saying this is that I'm the real one, not the one that Ron used to impersonate in the past. We won't go into the details of that, by the way, in case you know. I've actually known Lorna for 12 years, ever since the time she was studying with Brenda at Ealing College, and I think they were doing a joint award secretarial and vodka drinking course. And I've known Ron for years now as well, ever since Lorna introduced him as her new toy boy. I'm a teacher in a nearby secondary school, hence the suit. However, I assume that my job is not one of the reasons I was chosen to be best man on this occasion. Something to do with being able to speak in public, I don't know. Perhaps Ron thought I wouldn't be too nervous, or that I might actually be good at public speaking. As an ex-teacher herself, Lorna will back me up on this. This is very different, from talking in front of a class of teenagers. For a start, I can still see some of you are listening. So, why me? I think the real reason is amongst their friends that they could have chosen, they thought I would be the one least likely to drag up lots of embarrassing stories from their past. Perhaps because I'm too nice, but more likely because I wasn't there, for instance, when Lorna staggered into a Greek restaurant late at night, climbed up on somebody's table. This is what I've heard. You know? Presumably in an attempt to gain a bit of height. Plucked several ethnic-looking musical instruments from the ceiling, handed them round the rather bemused diners, and told them in fluent Smirnoff to play something Greek, while she got back on the table and danced. Yeah? Or maybe I was chosen because I wouldn't make jokes at their expense. I'm not the sort of person, really, who would take up John Browning's suggestion, for instance, that we should make the couple walk under an arch of credit cards. For those of you who don't know, by the way, this is not an allusion to Lorna's occasional work at Amex, rather to her spending plans. Actually, I really don't think I was picked because I'm too nice. I think it was Ron who selected me, because I don't know any embarrassing stories about him, which unfortunately is true. So, we've got this book here which we're going to pass around. Sorry, that book there. Brenda's got it, typical. And a pen, I hope, as well, so that anybody who does know embarrassing stories can, at the end of the evening, I'll let you know. Okay? Nevertheless, I will do my best to embarrass them. Apart from making this speech, my duties so far have been very limited. As the best man, originally second best man, in the old days, I could have been asked to deputise and take Ron's place if he didn't turn up. I was prepared to do my duty, but I'm extremely relieved that Lorna turned up. I'm also meant to read the telegrams, but I've been through a lot of weddings where that happens, so the telegrams are out there if you want to read them. I've refused to do that. I'm also supposed to help lead the dancing afterwards, but I've refused to do that on the grounds of public safety. So my only other job tonight, that's left after this, is to keep an eye on Ron.
Yeah.
Apparently, I've been told to do.
Yeah.
Make sure he doesn't drink too much. Make sure he doesn't fall asleep, as he does when he comes round to us. You can tell why now, at least, after I started speaking. Perhaps they thought I might be an expert on marriage, having been married for a very long time.
20 years.
Yes, it is true. I can recommend the idea after nearly 20 years. Yeah? I feel we're just getting started. I do believe in marriage. And indeed, our great leaders, the country, are busy promoting the idea. I believe that William Hague, for instance, is pushing the idea of the institution of marriage. So, Lorna and Ron, you're right to get married now before it dies out altogether. But really, I'm not sure there are any experts on marriage. There's no doubt that there have been some true and some witty things said about marriage, but I've managed to avoid those and give you some others. Okay? So that great wit Anonymous said, for instance, that love begins when you sink into his arms and ends with your arms in his sink. This was presumably a quote from a woman, as are virtually all the cynical things said about marriage. For instance, the card on the 10th wedding anniversary from a wife which read, "Thanks for 3 wonderful years." Mind you, the male chauvinists have had their say too. One of them said that the only really happy people are married women and single men. Mind you, he liked to think of himself as a philosopher, and everybody knows philosophers are people who give helpful advice to people happier than themselves. An outsider's view of marriage comes from a supposed friend of two more philosophers, Thomas Carlyle and his wife. He described them as the perfect couple, because if they hadn't been married to each other, 4 people would have been miserable instead of just the 2. In the end, however, I did find something more appropriate, and from an unusual source. Lorna sent me a quote, along with the detailed plans for this speech, in one of her many emails from work. She managed to squeeze out just a little free time from her hectic schedule to send me a few quotations from the great and the good, and also from Prince Philip, who is supposed to have said, "When a man opens a car door for his wife, it's either a new car or a new wife." I don't know whether he actually has ever opened a car door in his life, but if you've seen Ron's new Audi, you know what we mean. I'm certainly no expert on weddings either, although I've fought my way through gallons of Liebfraumisch paint stripper and balanced crumbly vol au vents on paper plates with the best of them. But I do seem to have one very useful knack, weddings. Wherever I go, disasters seem to follow me. It's not my fault. I freeze in the church, make my way down this ridiculous lineup they usually have, you know, like an England footballer, shaking hands with all the dignitaries before losing it home to Liechtenstein reserves or Tibet. I pour stale sherry in the plant pots and generally do my best to make polite conversation with other people's relatives. I do my bit, and I can't imagine why these disasters keep following me around. Why, for instance, was it at my own wedding that the minister's dog collar fell off? By the way, it makes no difference. It's still legal, I checked. Why was it me, amongst others, who had to keep a straight face when the vicar started my brother's wedding ceremony with the words, "Dear mourners," and then proceeded to scramble frantically into the wedding section of his prayer book? Incidentally, if you've looked at your order of service, was it? Give your grave to Ronald Frank. It's good. He did say it. But why was it me, for instance, who was a guest at a winter wedding in the Pennines, where the roads were all blocked with a heavy snowfall, and the bride turned up 5 hours late in the back of the only 4-wheel drive truck available, obviously a coal truck, yeah? And then we carried on with a black and white wedding. Well, once the groom had been treated for minor burns, because he was standing in front of a Calagas fire to try and dry out his soggy trousers. We didn't really mean to laugh. We just thought he started the Irish dancing early. Why did I have to be there when the priest, who, having asked if anyone knew of any just impediment why X and Y should not be married, left such an inordinately long gap? An awkward silence, a shuffling of feet and people coughing, that Auntie aircraft or tank or something, piped up from the back row and shouted, "Would you please be quiet whilst the vicar passes sentence?" Perhaps all this is why I am qualified to be best man. After all, I've seen the worst, or, well, the night is yet young. What I have learnt, though, is that a wedding is just a celebration. We might as well enjoy ourselves and do what we want to do and start enjoying ourselves, which you can do as soon as this speech is finished. Okay? So,
But not yet.
no, not yet. What are we to celebrate? Well, it's not a new union, for a start. They've been living together for a number of years. I mean, they're planning a new kitchen, I can say. But this is an important day. It marks a major milestone in their relationship, and it provides the opportunity for a lot of drinking. So, we're here to celebrate love. Better paid people than I have defined love, and who am I to argue with them? I do know love is not rational. I hate these people who say, "Why did you fall in love?" Well, obviously, if there was a reason, it wouldn't be love. I'd also like to celebrate two people who are great as individuals, but even better as a couple. I've known Lorna for longer, known her generosity, her liveliness, and her resilience. I've seen a few of her wild moments and heard of a great deal more, and I've seen her grow inwardly, if not upwardly. Okay. I've got to know Ron, seen him relax over the years, become younger, possibly more fun.
Here, here.
He's always caring, supportive, and he only has two rather conflicting vices, namely sport and Newcastle United. Obviously, he's more amiable on the rare occasions where when they win. He's still smiling today, even though they lost. But he hasn't actually gone so far as to wear his hair in dreadlocks. I don't know why.
Impossible.
But a lot could be made of the age difference, although we're on shaky ground here, mostly because it's impossible to say something nice about one of them without insulting the other. But I suppose I'm bound to say...
You couldn't tell who's the eldest, can you?
Well, exactly. You see what I mean? But I'm bound to say anyway that whilst it's not entirely irrelevant, age is far less important than things like love, compatibility, income, and so on. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, they're at the perfect age. They're old enough to know better and young enough to go ahead and do it anyway. So there'll be no ageist jokes from me. Instead, I'd like you to stand and raise your glasses. And Ron, you can take the sonatogen as well. I'm ready for this as well, as Peter gives the toast.
I bet some of you didn't know that Phil could make a speech like that. Excellent. Now, unfortunately, our friends Ron and Lorna can't be with us today because they're on a month's holiday in Vietnam and Cambodia. I mean, you know, really, some people do have a nice time, don't they? However, I think they must have forgiven Phil for some of the things he said in that speech because they've recorded the following tributes to him here. So there's Ron first, then Lorna.
Hello, everyone. Lorna and I are so sad we are not able to attend today's celebration of life for my good friend Phil. What a man. Brenda asked me to write one of my ditties for today, so here goes. My good friend Phil, what a man, so very quick, made me a Phil fan. Remember his IQ, his wit so fast, smiles and laughter, oh what a blast. Phil was a teacher at a local school. Languages was his forte, used as his tool to inspire kids day to day, to improve themselves, come what may. Charity then beckoned Phil to work. Researching stats was a perk. He enjoyed himself supporting them. My good friend Phil, what a gem. And then Phil started running. Marathons were stunning, unbelievable times, ever so fast. Nothing could match him in the class. 6 years ago, Phil's battle began. Brave and resolute, such a strong man. With body and voice failing him, eye movement provided an important limb. So Phil turned to fundraising for MNDA. Guinness Book of Records, if you may, and wheelchair pushers with Marcus at the helm. Nothing in the world could stop both of them. But what do you think our Phil could do next? Of course, write a book, which I suspect, with great interest, will be published quite soon, and many buyers will end up in a swoon. My good friend Phil, what a man. Rest in peace, I'm sure he can. Goodbye, my mate, forevermore. Good memories we will always store.
I'll never forget the first time I ever met Phil. Picture the scene, 1986. Brenda and I met whilst we both decided to leave the teaching profession and signed up to do a diploma in French and business at Ealing College. At the time, Brenda and Phil were living in Crawley, where Phil was working as a teacher. Brenda and I had to go into London to watch a film in French as part of the course. She asked me if it was okay if our husband Phil, who spoke French, could join us. Understandably, I had no problem with this, as I thought it'd be very nice to meet Phil. We arranged to meet at Tottenham Court Road Station, just by the Dominion Theatre. Phil was already there waiting for us when we arrived. After being introduced to each other, I asked him if he had a good journey up from Crawley, to which he replied it wasn't too bad. In fact, he made it a lot quicker than he had originally anticipated. I expressed my surprise that trains could ever be considered to be more efficient than expected, to which Phil replied, "Oh no, I didn't come by train. I walked." Crawley to London is a mere 31 miles. Needless to say, when Phil took up running, I was not in the least bit surprised. As time went by, I met Ron, and together we would meet up most Fridays with Brenda and Phil, who had now moved to Clock House in Beckenham, and have a fun end-of-week dinner and drinks together. They hosted several dinners, barbecues, birthday parties, all amazing great fun with exceptional food, as Phil was such a fantastic, adventurous cook. On one occasion, they hosted a barbecue, and I sat next to Phil drinking and generally having a good laugh, when Chaka Khan, the singer, came blasting out over their stereo system. At this point, Phil, who was holding a beer can, casually threw it on the floor and said, "Chaka Khan," as in chuck a can. He was quiet, yet so witty. In February 1994, we decided it was the perfect month to go to a freezing southern island. Oh, how we were cold, especially as Brenda and Phil's bed and breakfast room not only didn't have any heating, but appeared to have had an army of Mexican gremlins in the pipework in their room, resulting in no sleep whatever. Of course, we will never forget hiring a canal boat for Ron's 50th in May 1997, where Phil and Brenda put on a wonderful rendition of Blaydon Races as Ron comes from Newcastle, as did Phil. As time went on, Brenda and Phil moved to Orpington, and not to miss out, we did the same 8 months later. Approximately 25 years later, we both still live in our respective houses, filled with fun memories of our times together. Many a time we'd all fall asleep after a hard week at work, but that never deterred us from meeting up, whining and dining, then promptly passing out on the sofa. Ron and I got married in March 1999, and Phil was our best man. He was amazing, so in charge, yet totally unflustered. His speech had everyone in stitches, especially when he took to explain the Italian tradition of giving 5 sugared almond favours to each guest, representing each of the couple's wishes: love, health, happiness, fertility, and long life together. Phil, however, decided to add an extra favour, a little blue one representing Viagra. Prior to us having children, we would spend New Year's Eve together, usually going out to restaurants and staggering back somehow. However, for the Millennium New Year's Eve, I was heavily pregnant with our firstborn, so decided we should host a dinner. In early November, we met to discuss how this big night was going to take place. Music choices, food, of course catered by Phil, drink, fine wine, of course, and not to forget, dress code. After much deliberation, it was determined that the theme was to be pantomime, i.e. men dressed as dames and women as men. It was just the funniest thing to see Phil arriving in Brenda's dress, wig and makeup. Scariest and more surreal was when we were actually having dinner and the men decided to take off their wigs as they were too hot, and we now had Phil and Ron sat at the table eating and drinking, fully made up, wearing dresses. Thankfully, we have photographic evidence which we will truly treasure, as it will always bring a smile to my face. No matter what challenges were given to Phil, he was always a true trooper. I'll never forget you, Phil. You will always have a place in my heart.
Now Sue Ray is going to come and talk to us a little bit, carrying on with Phil's life story. Sue is another of Phil's research colleagues at Age UK. Thank you, Sue.
When Help the Aged merged with Age UK, Phil became one of the research managers in charge of knowledge management. He really loved his work and enjoyed bouncing his ideas off other colleagues. He seemed to be able to think outside the box, and together with the rest of the team, helped bring in measures to raise the profile of the older person's plight and make life a bit easier for them. He wanted to help make a difference, and I think most people at Help the Aged and Age UK will agree that he did. Some of his ideas were quite innovative. Actually, most of his ideas were very innovative, and he kept people in line with his insistence on any publications or statements being evidence-based. As he turned 50, Phil took up marathon running. I don't think he would ever claim to have been the fastest for his age, but he had real stamina and always got round the course. 2 of his 6 marathons were run in 30-degree temperatures. In 2014, his speed started to drop a little, and this continued in 2015, each run a little slower than the last. Eventually, his walking slowed, and he found that by the time he reached the office in the mornings, he could barely get up the stairs. His breathing gradually became more difficult, and he started to lose weight with all the effort he was having to put in to doing anything. On 8th July, he was told he had MND and 18 months to 2 years to live. So what does he do? He takes on a new challenge. He would not concentrate on the things he could no longer do. Neither would he spend time worrying about the things he could still do, but might very soon not be able to. No. Phil, being Phil, decided to focus on the things he could do with MND, which he hadn't been able to do before he developed the disease. Still working for Age UK, albeit from home, Phil came up with a number of projects to help raise awareness of the disease and funds for the MND Association. Among other things, he volunteered to help with stats and did press and TV interviews, even one with Turkish TV, to raise awareness, etc. The rationale behind this was, okay, so he'd got MND. What could he possibly do to stop other people getting it in the future? He wanted to help get a cure. And here's Chris James, Director of External Affairs at the MND Association, to tell you a bit about what they do.
Hello, everyone. Firstly, Brenda, thank you so much for asking me to come today. It's a real privilege to represent the MND Association and talk to you a little bit about the work that we do on this celebration of Phil's life. Before I do that, and I know you want me to talk about the MND Association, I did just want to mention a couple of occasions where I met Phil as part of my work. And the first one was to come and see Brenda and Phil in their home. And obviously, as you've heard, Phil had enormous experience in the voluntary sector and working in charities. And he was very keen, I'm sure you won't be surprised, to pass on that knowledge to the new charity that he was involved in, the MND Association. And my role covers things like policy and campaigning and communications. And of course, he was fascinated by that area. And I have to say, I spent a fantastic morning with Phil and Brenda, hearing Phil's ideas and thoughts about how the MND Association could develop its policy work and its campaigning work. And I should say that stayed with me. It made a real impression on me and stayed with me when we were developing our promises last year as our new strategy. And I'm going to talk a bit about that in a moment. The second occasion was completely different. It was the occasion of a press day to promote, and I have to try and get this right now, the world's fastest full marathon pushing a wheelchair, which Phil and Marcus undertook a few years ago. And we had this great press day down at Goodwood, where many of the press were media were there to do interviews. And Phil was on fantastic form. He was very determined. I think he spent most of the time badgering media people to interview me because I was there from the M&D Association. He was very keen that I got a chance to be interviewed. But it was a great day. And of course, when they actually came to do the challenge and the world record, it was achieved. And that was a fantastic achievement. So two very different occasions where I met Phil, and of course I had lots of contact with him over the years. But Brendan's really asked me to talk about the work of the M&D Association. There are 5,000 people with M&D in the UK at any one time, and you don't need me to tell you what a cruel and devastating disease that it is. I think it's important to say everybody's journey with M&D is different, but half of people will die within 2 years of diagnosis and a third within a year. So it can progress extremely rapidly. And of course, it has a devastating impact on the individual who gets MND, both in the fact that they will lose the ability to move, to walk, to talk, and of course, ultimately to breathe. So it can be a really cruel and devastating disease. And of course, it has a great impact on the family as well, and the friends of people who are affected by the disease. The M&D Association is essentially there to make sure that no one faces M&D alone. We have made a promise that we won't rest until M&D is treatable and curable. And I'm really pleased to say that I think we're making real progress in this area, thanks to the support of people like Phil and his family over the last few years. One of the most exciting things, I've been with the M&D Association for 10 years, and I've been waiting for this moment, but there is a drug that's just started for a small group of people with M&D, just started on the regulation process within the UK, which is extremely positive. And there is another drug which is a fairly earlier stage. In fact, it doesn't even have a commercial partner yet, but the trials have been very, very promising and interesting, which we hope we will be trying to get people access to as quickly as possible within the UK. So things are really moving. And of course, that's one of the reasons the M&D Association embarked over the last couple of years on a campaign with the government to fund more targeted M&D research and get more government funding, and we're successful in securing another £50 million of government research into M&D, which we were very pleased to be able to do. And we're raising our own commitment into research into M&D as well, in doubling our input this year, particularly on research funding. So there are exciting times, we hope, in terms of treatment and a cure for M&D. We're also working, of course, to make sure that everybody with MND gets the care they need when they need it. And we've used our influence with clinicians, with the NHS and social care services systems to improve the quality of someone's MND care, which, as we know, MND is an exceptionally complex disease and requires a lot of support and a lot of care. We also try to ease the impact of MND as much as possible by looking to support someone's quality of life. And that includes, in the last couple of years, of working with some real global leaders in technology to ensure that people with MND get accessible technology to improve their quality of life. And one of the most recent developments of that was last year, which is a fantastic new book called I Will Always Be Me, which helps people to bank their voice. And when I first started the M&D Association, if you wanted to bank your voice, and we know that 80% of people will lose the ability to communicate if they have MND, it would take a long time. It was very tiring. You had to catch it very early in the stage of MND before your voice started to go. This book, you can do it in half an hour. You basically just read the book and it banks your voice. Extraordinary technology, and that's been launched this year. So let's hope there are more things down the line for people for M&D like that. Phil was part of a very vibrant and powerful network, the M&D community. I heard someone with M&D say the other day that it's a community you don't really want to be part of. You'd rather not be in it. But once you are in it, it is very vibrant and it's very powerful, and we're very proud of the role that we play within it as the M&D Association. We want to make sure that MND is a well-known disease. Part of my other responsibility is comms and PR and things like that, and that's something that we want to drive as much as possible. the M&D community we work with, we don't never say we work for them, we work with the M&D community. It raises awareness, it campaigns and it fundraises, and it's very, very, very good at it. I can tell you that from my own personal experience, extremely good at it. And I'm proud to say that the M&D Association is influenced by people with M&D. We put people with M&D very much at the centre of everything we do as an association. All of this work, of course, requires funding, and we're hugely grateful for the support that we receive. And I want to thank Phil and Brenda and the family and all their friends for all the support that they've given the M&D Association over the last 6 to 7 years. We are very, very grateful. And finally, just want to say we'll always remember Phil at the M&D Association. Thank you.
So finally from me, Phil was very good at getting other people to do things for him. Enter the Run MND team and Team Phil. And here's Marcus Green to tell you about their exploits and making a difference.
I was diagnosed with motor neurone disease.
Right, and before that, were you a fairly active person?
Yes, indeed. I mean, my last marathon I did was in 2014. I've done 5 full marathons and loads of lots of walking and stuff. Well, I've certainly found that the association incredibly helpful and supportive. You get to know a lot about people when you've got motor neurone disease. The family and friends have been fantastic. The NHS has been great as well, but the association doing fantastic work. So I'd like to support them as much as I can, use the time I've got left to raise money for to hopefully cure and certainly care for people, to other people with MND.
So what are you going to undertake exactly with your challenge?
Well, I thought of being fairly adventurous. So I thought of swimming down Angel Falls, or trekking across the Sahara, or sort of going 10 rounds as Anthony Joshua, or conquering Everest in a really hard way. Should certainly raise some money.
So what in the end did you decide?
Well, really, if I take up the kind offer of the running team of MND, who've offered to push me around the Great South Run in Portsmouth in October, do that as a sponsored run, well, really that is my Everest. I think in my current physical condition, that's being very ambitious, and the main aim I have really is to stay alive until 21st of October. I'm fit enough to be pushed around the 10-mile course. On average, people who've got MND only live 2 years, and I've already had 2 years of my time.
That sounds a great challenge. Well done.
Thank you. See you there.
Hi everybody, I'm Marcus Green, great to meet those I haven't met before. So I think we've all heard it didn't take long after Phil's diagnosis in 2016 from to start thinking about how he could make a difference. It would have been so easy for him to give up once he was given a prognosis of just 2 years left to live. Yet he invested time in learning about the great work that the Motor Neurone Disease Association do for people with MND and their tireless efforts to find a cure while supporting those who live with the disease and their families and friends. It was through MNDA that Phil found out about Run MND, an incredible group of fit and fearless runners who push people in wheelchairs who are wheelchair bound. On the 21st of October 2018, Phil was pushed by the Run MND crew around the Great South Run course in Portsmouth, and they covered the 10 miles in a very respectable 2 hours and 14 minutes. He raised £15,000 and garnered local media coverage, all in the aid of focusing more attention on motor neurone disease and a cause that had become so close to his heart, research to find a cure. It was on this day that Phil got a taste of being pushed in his wheelchair. Dubbed his last race, it was really the first of his many challenges. At the finish, I was there unfortunately, Phil whispered in my ear, "What do you think the fastest is that anyone has ever been pushed in a wheelchair over a half marathon distance?" I looked at Phil, who had a mischievous look on his face, and then at Brenda, who wondered what he had just said to me. She knew it wasn't good. And so it began, and Team Phil was born. Weeks later, and the research was done, Phil and I were clear on a target. We had a time of 1 hour 35 minutes to beat to get a Guinness World Record. All we needed was a fast, flattish course somewhere in the south. Worthing had the perfect half marathon on in February, so we applied to Guinness World Records and we got clearance to give it a go. Phil saw that getting a Guinness World Record would give him an even greater platform and a voice to raise awareness and advocate for all those who live with MND, and to inspire others that despite his diagnosis, he could go out there and do something amazing. He managed to garner a lot of interest ahead of the attempt. We had some local press coverage and word was spreading. Phil had an everyday wheelchair, which Guinness World Records deemed was record legal. I can tell you, not easy to push. We did some training around Bromley Park and assembled a small Team Phil. The day itself arrived and we strapped Phil in with bungee cords, made sure his breathing mask and ventilator was secure. And as you can imagine, all of this with absolutely no complaints from Phil. And set off, hoping to break the world record. Brenda and others were dotted around the course to cheer us on. Phil's cap blew off about 100 metres into the attempt, and from this moment we knew it wasn't going to be plain sailing. There were some tricky moments, hopefully not squeamish. I could hear a noise coming from down by Phil's arms, and noticed that one of them had slipped off the armrest and his hand was resting on top of the spinning tyres. There was another moment where we had to get up onto the esplanade, and in doing so, we adopted a 45-degree tilt. But miraculously, Phil stayed in his wheelchair. But we crossed the finish line in just under 1 hour 30 minutes and broke the Guinness World Record. Phil was delighted and Team Phil was on the map. And a few months later, the record was ratified. Phil was officially amazing, though to most of us, he already was. Of course, Phil had an itch that wasn't properly scratched, though. We got some good publicity, but unbeknownst to most of us, he was already scheming for the next challenge. As Brenda's sister Pam will tell us shortly, he had other plans up his sleeve and knew that we knew we had to go bigger and better to give him the stage to make the difference he wanted. We were eating around the dinner table at Phil and Brenda's one night in the summer of 2019, and Phil waited until Brenda was out of the room and asked me, "I know we've done the half, but what about the full marathon?" Brenda came back into the room and felt like she had left two naughty school children to their own devices for too long. "What are you scheming this time?" You don't want to know, Brenda. In only 6 months, we were lining up at the Goodwood Motor Circuit, looking to beat the Guinness World Record of 3 hours and 5 minutes for the full marathon. This time round, we had much more publicity in the run-up with the BBC, ITV and the local press, and the attempt was timed perfectly with the release of Phil's new book, Motor Neurone Disease, The Fun Bits. I've never quite got my head around the trust that Phil instilled in me. I was essentially pushing what could only be described as a badly behaved shopping trolley with no brakes for 11.5 laps, which Phil had zero control over. And this was no comfy armchair, but a wheelchair made for short distances, which he had to endure for 3 hours. All the more incredible was the fact that Phil had only recently been discharged after an extended stay in hospital with pneumonia. Team Phil was fully mobilised, this time with a few of my Winchester running friends for company, who would push a running buggy loaded with Phil's spare ventilator. And off we went. It was windy, cold. There were tough moments for sure, but 2 hours and 58 minutes later, we rapidly approached the finish line, although it was too late to spot the speed bump, and as we hit it, the force nearly tossed Phil out of the chair. You'll see that in the video in a minute. It was an incredible day, with so many out there to cheer us on. The coverage we received afterwards was incredible. The media interviews with Phil, Brenda, MNDA and others were hugely impactful. Double world record holder Phil had inspired so many. those with motor neurone disease and indeed other limiting illnesses, to focus on what you can do and not on what you can't do. Speaking to Brenda more recently, it is clear just how much of an impact this day, the build-up and aftermath really had on Phil. You can guess what I'm going to say next. Yes, Phil did not rest on his laurels. Being unable to leave the house because of the lockdown and his health deteriorating, he used his ingenuity and figured out that he could still maximise what he could do to raise awareness. The less he was able to do, the more positive and determined he became. This was the birth of Phil's Blinkathons, giving him umpteen opportunities for puns and play on words. Equating steps to blinks, in May 2020, he set his sights first on blinking his way up each of the 3 peaks, Scafell Pike, Snowdon and Ben Nevis. He conquered all 3 within a month. Quite a featless feat, as Phil put it. Given he blinked over 30,000 times to do it. Not satisfied with reaching the highest summit in the UK, he aimed higher. Mont Blanc by June, and then even higher by July, he blinked his way to the top of Everest, the blinking hard way, totaling 58,000 blinks. One small step for man, one giant blink for MND, said Phil. He even received recognition from Chris Bonington, who was the first to climb Everest the hard way in 1975. MNDA's Mission 5000, a mile for every person living with MND in the UK, later that year gave Phil an opportunity to once again connect with the wider community. He blinked over 40,000 times to a full marathon, fundraising £5,000 in the process, alongside his other blinking challenges. In November, he took on by far his biggest blinking challenge, blinking the entire distance from John O'Groats to Land's End, a distance Phil described as a mere 1.4 million blinks. This was ambitious, even by Phil's standards. Phil embarked on his journey. 400,000 blinks in, reaching Dalwhinnie by December, Gretna by January, and 1 million blinks to Monmouth by February. Another more serious bout of pneumonia in hospital made it even more challenging for Phil. But despite all this, he reached John O'Groats in July 2021, 8 months and 1.4 billion blinks later. Blinking amazing. His motivation? To cheer people up. He said, when you are stuck indoors watching all your muscles die, it's nice to know that you can still do something amazing. By November 2021, Phil had reached a total of £50,000 raised for MNDA, a colossal amount and testament to his dedication to the cause from the moment he was diagnosed with MND. He had set out to fundraise £10,000 back in 2016, when he first embarked upon the Great South Run Challenge. 5 years later, and he had absolutely smashed that target. His fundraising total is no doubt well beyond £50,000 today, but Phil was interested in so much more than raising money. He wanted to give hope to others in a similar situation to himself. And he dedicated the rest of his life to showing people that despite a limiting illness, he didn't allow his life to be limited as he went from project to project. Phil did all of this not just to raise awareness and encourage better care and support for people with MND and more funding towards a cure, but with his can-do attitude, he set an example for us all to follow. Phil is a huge inspiration to me, as he has been to so many of us. When I joined Age UK, he was a fount of knowledge, as well as being side-splittingly funny. He mentored and helped me to get to grips with the world of charity research. Towards the end of my time at Age UK especially, I felt like we had become kindred spirits, ambitious in wanting to make a difference to older people through statistics and research, with a big dollop of creativity along the way. I absolutely idolised the way his brain worked. I could never have dreamt that we could go on to achieve what we did together. I feel very privileged that Phil saw enough in me to think I could help him realise his ambitions, and we pretty much continued where we left off after my time at Age UK. In his last few months, I let him know, sorry Brenda, that Team Phil will go on in his memory. Such as his legacy, I don't think we'll be the only ones. Thank you.
keeps enjoying what he can do, doesn't focus on what he can't do.
Marcus and Phil have 11 laps to negotiate. They want to break the existing world record of just over 3 hours.
Steph, what's your advice going to be to him? Hold on tight. Yeah.
Absolutely incredible. Well done.
Well done, you, sir.
They make quite a team, and they're not stopping here.
Welcome, my friends. Thanks for joining me for the last few blinks to the summit of Everest. Feel free to blink with me if you want. Well, here goes. 10, 9, and 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, and 2, 1. Well, we made it. One small step for man, one giant blink for MND. Break out the cork and cheers. Hold on a minute. Is that a Yeti over there? Mustache, thanks for coming. Goodbye. Everyone, I've just finished my mission. 5,000 for MND. Blinked just under 42,000 times, representing 26.2 miles. That's 1,600 blinks per mile. Now I'm going the extra mile for MND to raise £5,000 here. I am finishing my 27.2 miles. Hooray, hooray, hooray.
Amazing. Hello, my name is Pam. I'm Brenda's sister. At the same time as undertaking these fundraising activities, Phil also started serious writing. He'd always had a flair for writing and probably could have had a career as an author, as well as potentially one in stand-up. Having lost the ability to use his fingers for typing, he found it more and more difficult to edit text or cut and paste for research, for work. Manipulating spreadsheets, for example, was becoming impossible. Nevertheless, he could still write plain text, and with the help of WordPress, he started a blog. These blog posts went on to form the basis of Phil's first book, Motor Neurone Disease, The Fun Bits, a title to attract attention, certainly. And all of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with his bits of philosophy, and Brenda's going to read some to us now.
Thanks, Pam. A farewell to legs. Life, the universe, and everything. I get a lot of lovely feedback from you, dear readers, for which I am very grateful. Like many writers, I say I appreciate all feedback, good and bad. And, like them, I'm lying. Personally, I think ego massaging ought to be an Olympic sport. Fortunately, the most common word to be used by my backfeeders is inspirational, and that makes me both very humble and proud. I have had lots of comments, but only one question with several variations. For example, how can someone in your position be so damn cheerful? Or, why are you so insanely optimistic? A fair question, you may think, but to me it's a completely meaningless one. You might as well ask me why I decided to have grey eyes. I have no idea why I am so upbeat about my situation although I'm sure the constant support of Brenda and Team Phil has a lot to do with it. And I include you, dear reader, as part of the team. After all, what's the point of writing all about those fun bits if nobody reads it? 42. Ted, the teacher trainer, was fond of saying that there are only two types of people: radiators and drains. As a rather arrogant young man, I thought this was a wild generalization, worse than dividing all of humanity into optimists and pessimists, or, heaven forbid, a glass half full or a glass half empty kind of guy. If, in the unlikely event that you hear me say something like that, and in the even more unlikely event that you can make out a single sodding word I'm saying, then please feel free to fill my mouth with soap and make me rinse it out with a glass of water. A half full one, of course. And if I ever write it, take me straight to the PDSA and do not pass go. But I digress again. The world is not divided into optimists and pessimists. We are far too complex creatures for that. Sometimes we would be on one side of that fence, sometimes on the other. Sometimes we'd just be sitting on it. The Pipe Fitter's Guide to the Galaxy. No, 3 hard but fun years of having lived with MND. They've convinced me that the human race is really divided into Ted's 2 camps. I'm sure you will recognise people who fit into them. Radiators listen to and engage with what you're saying. They tend to be considerate and open to new ideas. They are not angels, and they may lapse occasionally, particularly if they're depressed. But they also tend, in the words of my favourite carer from St. Christopher's, we're probably not supposed to have favourites, but what the hell, they tend to be dewy people. Like her, they leave you feeling better about yourself than you did before. Drains are, of course, the opposite, but they're not necessarily bad people. In fact, many are well balanced, having a chip on both shoulders. They may really want to do better, but they don't. Drains may not want to be constantly negative, to always have an answer ready in order to crush any positive ideas or enthusiasm, to play the real-life dementor, but they do. They may feel that their bad luck or painful experience entitles them to be bitter, cynical, and unkind, but it doesn't. In fact, some of the hottest radiators have gone through terrible times, like Nelson Mandela or Stephen Hawking, and some of the guzzliest drains I know have lived very carefree lives. But most people are neither heroes nor villains, yet we all have to decide which side of that fence we're on, and this time there's no sitting on it. Because I believe there is no middle ground. You can't suddenly decide to be something else, something like a pump or a thermostat, for instance. You're either someone who radiates positivity and goodwill, or you're sucking the life out of other people and making lives a misery, particularly your own. So which side of the fence are you on?
Phil decided to take his readers on a world tour. Of course, this was nothing like a travelogue and often didn't say much at all about the country he was visiting. But each blog post was entertaining, informative, and always had a moral. The world tour comprised 26 posts and took him about a year to write using his trusty switch button and iPad switch control software. In 2022, he came upon the idea of putting some images to the text, and so the Phil No Muscles Rides Again series of vlogs was born. And whilst the first few episodes are a little tame, Brenda said, they are mostly very professional, thanks in no small part to Dave Edwards, who matched the images with the soundtrack, and added special and audio effects. Dave is the guy there with the video camera, filming us all. You can see them all on YouTube. In a moment, we're going to watch the latest in the series. Phil thought Ireland and the Irish were wonderful. His writings, however, were not always that politically correct. So Brenda apologises in advance to any Irish guests here today, and we hope you will forgive him. So here's episode 17, What Friends Are For.
Episode 17, What Friends Are For. People ask me how I keep writing my little blog when I am in such a parlous physical state. They may not put it that way, but being at stage 4 can never be a good thing. The simple answer is, with a lot of help from my brilliant wife, from health and care services, from family and friends. So how come I am lying on my back on the roof of a high castle tower, with my head sticking out of an unnervingly large drainage hole, being held by a complete stranger with his hands gripping the backs of my trainers? I won't say that my whole life flashed before my eyes, but several burning questions did cross my mind. For instance, what the hell am I doing here, in a country big on faith but maybe not so hot on health and safety? What did I hope to achieve here, and did I do my shoelaces up tight this morning? This could only be Ireland, the country that takes the sir out of surreal. The land where people can give directions like, when you see the white bridge, you know you've gone too far. Apparently everyone goes too far. I wonder why. This is the Republic of Ireland, the bigger southern bit of the island, but I would say to the citizens of Northern Ireland, you're not off the hook either. Actually, the word hi is a bit superfluous here. Any slip from any tower would have had me conveniently breaking my fall with my neck. And then there's the contagion risk. For this is Blarney, one of those rare places where hope just might triumph over experience. One of those spots where people fervently believe that faith will heal all. Towns like Lords in southern France, or Barnard Castle in northern England, the site of the miraculous vision of the blessed Dominic of Cummings. I have had the Lord's experience, queuing for hours, surrounded by genuine pilgrims who were waiting for their turn to spend a few moments to pray at the shrine of Saint Bernadette, hoping for a miracle to heal their woes and sickness. We shuffle forward very slowly, held back from time to time by marshals letting in patients from the hospital on the other side of the square. Every so often, these priority cases would be ushered into the head of the queue, much to the satisfaction of the people in our line, who evidently felt that the patients in wheelchairs should have precedence. I sensed that their small sacrifice added to their feelings of devotion and piety. They could take an extra hour of waiting for the sake of people whose need was greater. No pain, no gain, and then came the beds. Those of you who have spent any time in an NHS hospital will know how hard it is to get hold of a hospital porter willing to take you in your bed to another part of the building. Take my word for it, I've been there, done that, got the embarrassing gown. Don't get me started on the subject of the hospital gown, that one-size-fits-all shroud of shame, a mortifying symbol which tells us that, no matter how important we were in the outside world, you are now merely the sum of your available orifices. I said don't get me started. What I was trying to say was that moving patients in their beds can be a logistical nightmare, but in Lords there seemed to be an endless supply of volunteers eager to save their charges from limbo, which at the time of my visit was still a part of papal doctrine. no sign of a flimsy gown here. The passengers in their rolling beds were in their Sunday best, dark suits and flowery dresses, and bringing up the rear of the welcome queue jumpers came a portly black figure resplendent in his cardinal's robes. After that, the Holy Spring and Shrine of Saint Bernadette could have come as a bit of an anticlimax, but that is, of course, very much not the point. The same goes for kissing the Blarney Stone, as if it's not unhygienic enough to be sharing the stone with a steady stream of fellow rockosculators. The steady stream analogy has given birth to another rural myth. The word on the lane is that every morning the guardians of this treasure take turns to pee on it. No explanation is proffered as to why they might do such a thing. A misguided attempt at sanitization, perhaps, or an expression of contempt for the tourists who come to give themselves a short path to eloquence, or simply because they can do. But everyone who has shared with me the indignity of getting themselves within kissing distance of the stone will know that the only way that any man or woman wishing to urinate on it could not do so without the assistance of a helicopter and a long rope, a siphon, a funnel and a family-sized turkey baster. At the risk of being wrongly called racist, this story is so typically Irish. Like so many English tourists before me, I don't exactly feel I'm Irish. That would be weird, but it is hard to resist the idea that I would fit right in here. Growing up in 1960s Manchester, I certainly knew a fair bit about the Irish, as they were responsible for much of the charm and just about all the disorganized crime. What I admired was their ability to say absolutely anything and their freedom from any kind of guilt. I wished I could get away with saying things just because they sounded right. I am going to take you to a place which could have been anywhere on the Emerald Isle, north or south. It's so typical that I won't name it, but for the purposes of this tale, let's call it Arklow. I make no apologies that we are here in the pub. I am not going to fall into the trap of talking to a couple of alcoholics and judging the whole nation. And this is such a nice place to come to. Ireland is the only country in the world that doesn't have any Irish-themed pubs, so this is a great place to talk. Talking is what it's all about here. Idle chatter, gossip, philosophy, everything under the sun is fair game. Even the alcohol plays second fiddle, acting as a lubricant to the conversation, elevated to an art form. Only the most dedicated talkers and drinkers are in this early in the evening, though they may well have been here since lunchtime, not counting the barman, who seemed to have eyes only for the tiny television. There were 3 locals at the bar. Initial impressions would have pigeonholed one of them as a distinguished-looking old gentleman in a distressed tweed suit, tie and handmade brogues. It was hard to guess his age, but he could have been either mid-70s or 50-plus Guinness. The other 2 seemed to be tramps. They were all talking at once, though I am not sure who to. This being Ireland, it didn't take long to strike up a conversation. Mr. Tweed made his precarious way over to our table. He seemed to be weaving to his own internal soundtrack, presumably a Force 10 storm in mid-Atlantic. One of the great things about Ireland is that you don't need an icebreaker to start a conversation with a stranger. The English have 400 years of Protestant guilt to wade through before we can get past hello. Nevertheless, Tweed's opener was a masterpiece of the art. Before bobbing and sidling his way over to us, he had seen me inspecting a framed map on the wall, the sort of fake oldie-worldy map you only find in pubs. As soon as he was safely leaning on our table, he said, "So, are you a chartographer then?" Apart from no, there wasn't a good answer to this, but it didn't matter. The hunt for common ground had begun. He found out I was a teacher, which prompted his response. I had a teacher once, pretty lowest common denominator stuff, but it did the job. I learned he was retired, and I made the mistake of asking what job he used to do, but he couldn't remember. Without a shred of embarrassment, he called over to the two tramps at the bar. Do you know what I used to be before I was an old soak? Young soak, ventured little tramp. Tweed seemed happy with that, and he then set about finding more common ground with his English guests. But whiskey lag had set in, and the best he could manage was, and the white cliffs of Dover will always be white. After a fair few repetitions, the white cliffs had lost their charm for everyone except Mr. Tweed, who seemed set for the night, so it was a relief when little tramp beckoned us over to join him at the bar. He ordered drinks all round, which brought back the question of how he and Tweed could finance this lifestyle. Guinness and Jameson's Chasers may be the finest drink since the 1929 Chateau Lafite unwashed, but it didn't come cheap. The clothing certainly wasn't a clue. He and his much larger counterpart were dressed in local tramp's uniform, dark but strangely greasy trousers of indeterminate origin and colour, worn-down plimsolls and matching blue cable-knit sweaters, which had seen better decades. Little tramp must have sensed the unasked question about money, and he volunteered that he too was retired, but he still mended the odd bike as well as repairing pots and pans. He was clearly proud of his tinker roots and still called himself the unknown solderer, but he also admitted that he relied on his best friend, indicating Big Tramp. The latter seemed reluctant to step into the limelight, but the question of affordability was soon answered. Sitting there in his tramp uniform, he admitted that he owned a fishing boat, well, actually, a small fleet of boats, and the harbour, and the quayside houses, and the hotel and 3 pubs, including this one, but he seemed happy to hang out with his friends. A truly Irish riches to rags story. So there you have it. You don't need divine intervention. You don't need to have kissed a stone. You can find happiness by engaging in eloquent and witty conversation with the help of an endless supply of liquid black gold and a friend who owns the town. Everybody gets what they want, and we all need a helping hand from time to time. Maybe not on the industrial scale with which I consume it, but we all accept assistance more often than we would like to admit. That's what friends are for.
Dave Edwards, a former teaching colleague of Phil's, was also the guy who in 2021 said he thought Phil's writing style was so good he should write a novel. Well, not being one to dodge a challenge, Phil took a break from his world tour blog and started his magnum opus, The Stealth Inspector. And here's a little excerpt to whet your appetite. It's a cracking read, full of Phil's wicked sense of humour. It's hot off the press and available on Amazon by searching for Phil Rossall, The Stealth Inspector. It'll come up. And all the profits go to the MNDA. So make sure you get your copy tonight when you go home.
Just a short extract. Heartless School had very few behavioural problems, and the small number of troubled families they did have to deal with were from remote farms and villages out and about, where mercifully the default child type was dumpling. Many of these were called Rid, but it was only the offspring of Jan Rid who could be bothered to export their troubles to others. The problem was that there were so many of them. Jan still housed grown-up children from his first 2 marriages, and Mother Earth had brought her unruly brood with her from Rid Myers. And then they had sextuplets. By this time, they'd run out of names. So the children were known as 1 to 6. Mother Earth had recently become a grandmother at the age of 34. No one knew how many children Jan had sired outside of wedlock, but his neighbour's verdict was unanimous. Jan Ridd, not much of a farmer, but one hell of a fertiliser. But Jan was as wily as a fox, and he had the morals of an MP. He soon grasped that there would never be a profit from farming, so he sold all his livestock and specialised in 3 things: benefit claiming, adventure tourism, and pornography. His films combined the usual pornographic cliches with stunning scenery, a sort of Hollywood with hypothermia. So far, the films were selling well, especially, and I paraphrase, the middle-aged, sexually attractive women of Sexmore and Debbie Does Dunster. Was it any wonder Phil's colleagues asked each other that the younger Ridlets had grown into such chaotic children? They were careful not to say so in public, though. Jan Ridd was vice chairman of the school's governors. Don't worry, we're almost finished now. There have been so many wonderful tributes to Phil, but there are 3 in particular which seem to really sum him up. And here is Ray Newman, who's one of the MND Association visitors locally here. They've all been a great help to us, to read those 3 tributes to us.
Thank you, Brenda. First, just to say, I'm an association visitor, and I have never seen Phil so fit, so wonderful. And it's just as Brenda said, it's given me great pleasure because every patient I get, I'm sad to say, has got the disease. So this has been wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Right, enough of that. These are tributes that Brenda has asked me to read. And please excuse me if I say the wrong name or pronounce it incorrectly. The first tribute is from Chandra Thenawara, who was a co-traveller with Phil and his family when he was young and a lifelong family friend. Little Phil, my friend of long ago, who grew up to be such an inspirational adult, so positively and humorously facing a devastating illness and keeping us entertained. An amazing reversal of roles. This must surely be unique. According to my religious beliefs, dear Phil, your future is very bright and we shall surely meet again. So au revoir, but not goodbye. The next tribute is from Jose, and I have tried to say this name umpteen times. Iparaguayi, apologies, Jose, who is a colleague at Age UK and had written on Facebook on the day that Phil died. Would I have given up? It's hard to tell, because unless you face the challenge, you don't know how to react. At least I didn't know how I would. Over 6 years ago, Phil was diagnosed with motor neurone disease, an uncommon, degenerative and incurable condition that affects how the brain communicates with the muscles through the nerves. And boy, he did not give up. He was given 2 years of life, if lucky. That was over 6 years ago. Since then, he raised thousands of British pounds for charity. At one point, he realised he could do blinking his eyes, work blinking his eyes. Okay, let's raise funds by blinking our eyes, he said. And he went on to blink 58,000 times for up to 2 hours a day over 11 consecutive weeks. Why 58,000 times? It's the number of steps needed to climb Everest. So he conquered the highest peak on the planet with his eyelids to help others with MND and those who may get it in the future. He teamed up with another dear friend, Marcus, who you've heard from, in one of those double acts that are impossibly hard to follow. They broke the Guinness World Record for the fastest marathon pushing a wheelchair. Not just once, of course not. Once would have been very easy, but by his standards, twice. And again, solely for the benefit of others whom he may have never met and those he surely never will. He wrote 2 books and a blog and even posted video blogs, all as his body was increasingly failing him. He finished his 2nd book when all he could move to put his ever sharp and witty thoughts on a screen was one thumb. He passed away today with his beloved wife Brenda at his side, as she always was. As soon as I heard the news, I shared the story with my teaching assistants, because Phil's life before and certainly after developing the condition has been one of the most inspiring examples of putting others first, of selflessly reaching out to those in need, and of not giving up. Marcus did a good job at those marathons, but Phil famously remarked, "Who crossed the finishing line first?" Yes, it was you, my friend, it was you, all the way. And the last tribute is from Hanora Lee, who also is a colleague at Age UK. It has been slightly edited by Brenda, which I hope she won't mind. Oh, Phil Rossall, the truest of human beings. You'll be so missed by so many of us. So many happy memories of such a special man, too many to share. But 3 things stand out to me about the legend that was and is Phil. 1, a selfless drive to always help others and a humanity that came without ego. 2, a quiet yet unparalleled determination which always meant he went above and beyond, whether he was seeking out the random, powerful stat I needed to win with some funding or smashing a world record, or indeed living so long with MND. Number 3, the best sense of humour that could have us all rolling in the aisles, whatever the weather. Phil has had such an impact on me, and I know I'm not alone. Rest in peace, dear Phil.
Well, Phil has already had quite a say this afternoon, but I wonder what he would say to you now if he were here, in summing up. Well, I think he'd say this.
Thank you everyone for coming this afternoon. Thank you too to everyone who's supported Brenda and me so brilliantly over the last 6.5 years. Read my novel and my first book if you haven't already, and I hope they'll make you laugh and smile. Watch any episodes of my vlogs that you haven't yet seen. I hope they'll make you smile too and make you think. Help to fight MND in any way that you are able to. And most importantly of all, don't be a drain. Be a radiator and inspire others with your positivity.
So that's about it, really. I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of things, just as we finish. We have a lovely painting over there in the buffet area, which my brother-in-law, Jim Bailey, did in 2018. It shows the various aspects of Phil's life, his running, his travelling, and his number crunching and so on. So you can have a look at that. It's quite an interesting painting. There are also 2 copies, well, one of each of Phil's books here, Motor Neurone Disease, The Fun Bits, and The Stealth Inspector. So I'll put those over here on the table. anybody wants to have a look. And of course, there are also the family floral tributes which came from the crematorium earlier this morning down here, so please come and have a look at those as well. Thank you all so very much for coming. It's been really brilliant. And let's give a round of applause for Phil, please.